Hello, everyone. So I love Warsaw. It's one of my favorite cities. I had a lot of fun last night, a little too much fun. So I will try to coordinate both a microphone and a PowerPoint together. Okay. So my story begins, as you saw in that trailer. That is a beautiful, it's Agnieszka Holland film. I mean, it's not my film. I can say it's objectively speaking, it's a beautiful film done by a 3-time Academy Award nominee, the elected chairwoman of the European Film Academy. Agnieszka has directed Europa, Europa, the story of a Jewish boy who hides in Hitler's youth for survival. She directed The Secret Garden. She's done a ton of television, like The Wire, Rosemary's Baby, and The Affair. I mean, I'm in Warsaw, I don't have to tell you who Agnieszka Holland is, but I'm pointing this out that she is a queen of European cinema, and for anybody ever trying to get a story told, especially something as big as a film, this film looks like it's a $30 million film. I'm not gonna say how much it actually was, but the way this all came together was little old me, little tiny me, a journalist who is working in a horribly hurt industry. We have newsrooms shrinking across America, less journalism jobs. You have social media coming in, doing a lot of great things and also a lot of terrible things. And so how do you get a film made, especially dealing with Hollywood, which is hugely misogynistic, hugely white. And so a lot of people who are marginalized in society, they have a very difficult time navigating that world. So what I'm gonna walk you through is my own personal experience, and what I want you to know is that you have a story inside of you. You have to fight, and peel yourself off the ground over and over and over again to get that story told. And the way you're gonna do that is by always grounding yourself into the reality of what and who is sustaining you. And so this, for me, was that answer. This is my grandfather, Oleksiy. He was born in Donbass, Ukraine, a part of eastern Ukraine that's now under Russian occupation. Historically, Donbass was very Ukrainian. It was sort of a hotbed of Ukrainian intellectual thought and national identity. He grew up speaking Ukrainian in his family farm. As a young boy, he witnessed the Tsar's army being pulverized by a bunch of tattered and barefoot Bolsheviks. Then, as a young man, he and his family barely survived Stalin's genocide-famine in Ukraine, the subject of my film. Then, as a young father with an infant son, he was arrested during Stalin's purges and tortured and forced to confess against committing crimes against the Kremlin, against the state. He thought this was very personal to him, that they got the wrong man that was trying to overthrow Stalin. He didn't realize at first that this was a systemic terrorism that was going on across the Soviet Union at the time. And so he spent about a year or so in prison, being starved, tortured. It was horrific. And then when he comes out, shortly thereafter, the Nazis invade. So my grandfather lived the events that George Orwell allegorized in Animal Farm. And we all had that person who was the world to us when we were a child. And for me, it was him, my dude Lonya. And so when I was maybe 10, I told my class in California where I grew up. I'm American. I was born and raised in Northern California. And I told my school in a presentation the horrific story that in 1933, Stalin deliberately mass murdered millions of his own people, the majority Ukrainians. And Ukraine was very fertile. That was the breadbasket of the empire. And Stalin took the grain and sold it abroad to raise money to modernize his empire. And this dark, horrible secret was covered up with the help of the New York Times. And this story sounded very shocking. And at the time, Ukraine was being studied in academia through a Russian lens. So you had to really know somebody who knew somebody who could give you a book to tell Ukraine's story through a Ukrainian perspective. Because people in America, very lazy, sort of understanding the world through two global superpowers, Russia versus America, they saw Ukraine as little Russia, not realizing that Ukraine is centuries older than Russia and so forth. And so it wasn't until more archives started opening up in former Soviet states and more information being available and a younger, sort of more energetic wave of historians were coming in, like Timothy Snyder at Yale, Anne Applebaum, and so forth, when you had all this great scholarship come out on telling Ukraine's story through the eyes of Ukrainians. And just to give you an example of that, at the height of Stalin's famine, there was a death certificate from Ukraine, and the cause of death was simply being Ukrainian. So that's how horrendous this little-known genocide was. So I had this crazy idea when I was in university and studying Soviet history. I was supposed to be working on some big fancy thesis report, and I couldn't do it. Instead, I procrastinated by fantasizing about making a film to honor my grandfather and all the millions who suffered. And the more I dug into the villain in my story, Walter Duranty, played by the great Peter Sarsgaard, a brilliant actor and a wonderful human being, the more I dug into the villain of the story, Walter Duranty, he was this king of Moscow. He was a Brit who, if you were an expat, if you were a great journalist or thinker, artist going to Moscow in 1933, you had to pay pilgrimage to the great Walter Duranty. He threw the most amazing parties. In 1920s, he was a lover of the great Satanist Aleister Crowley. They would have these satanic black magic orgies, and Walter Duranty would write these verses for them to shout out in the orgies. It's really fascinating stuff when you're in college and procrastinating and digging into this fantasy screenplay you hope one day you'll get around to writing. So the more I dug into this, the more I thought, this is my film, I'm gonna do this, I don't care what it takes, I'm gonna make it happen somehow. And so this is the somehow. And so I needed a hero. And when I was living in Ukraine after college, I stumbled upon a little-known independent journalist by the name of Gareth Jones, played by James Norton. And Gareth Jones was from a small town in Wales. He spoke several languages fluently, a brilliant student, and thank God for history, he didn't drink. So when he got to Moscow in Walter Duranty's glamorous world, he was bored. So he had to sneak his way into Ukraine, and he did so by just being cunning and brilliant. And he got off a train and walked through ghost village after ghost village, as though all the people had been abducted by aliens. And this was the famine. And so Gareth escaped and came out and held a big press conference, and he was the first to say, this is a man-made famine. Millions are being deliberately slaughtered. And what happens is the great Walter Duranty and a lot of the leading journalists of the day covering Moscow for the world, they were the translators of the Soviet Union for the West, for newspapers like the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, and so forth. They were pressured by the Soviet censors to write articles basically saying that Gareth Jones was lying and to muddle the truth and to confuse the situation and make people basically move on. And a couple years later, when Gareth was on a reporting trip, he fell in with two men that we now know were connected to the Soviet secret police, and he ended up dead. And he was shot 3 times in the back the day before his 30th birthday, and history forgot him. And then a girl from Northern California came along and became obsessed with him. And I think the real Gareth Jones would have thought that was the funniest thing. And so unfortunately for my screenplay, this story was tragic. Walter Duranty wins. The big giant in media wins, and Gareth is forgotten. So looking for inspiration, I turned to George Orwell himself, because I'm connected to him through my grandfather's story. And I'm reading this introduction to Orwell's Animal Farm written by Christopher Hitchens. I'm not a fan of Hitchens. I think he's a misogynist. He wrote this piece for Vanity Fair saying that women cannot be funny. Some of the biggest comedians today in America that are helping us survive Trump are women. But so unfortunately, I first learned about this incredible story I'm about to share through the misogynist and writer Christopher Hitchens. And Hitchens was sharing a story on how Orwell struggled for years to get Animal Farm published. And an independent press finally published it, put out some copies, and one ended up in the hands, miraculously, of Ukrainian immigrants stranded in World War II refugee camps. And these immigrants immediately understood what Orwell was trying to say with Animal Farm. And this is an incredible story of Ukrainian and Polish hipsters stranded in Germany after the war. It was this great story of Polish and Ukrainian unity, of these kids working with each other, and through their literature club and interests, they were able to hunt down Orwell's home address in London and write him a letter in flowery broken English saying, "Who are you, and how did you know what we lived through? We thought that no one in the West knew the truth." Because Stalin was a great World War II hero. Stalin helped the West defeat Hitler. So who is this Orwell that dared challenge the great Stalin? And Orwell gets this letter at a very critical time in his life. His wife had just died in routine surgery. She had an allergic reaction to the anesthesia. And that left him a single father of the young boy that they had just adopted, whose parents had been killed in the raids on London. So here was Orwell, a widow, a single father, in mourning, and he gets a letter from these Ukrainians saying, like, this book is changing our lives, and we're translating it into Ukrainian, and we just want you to know that. And so Orwell works with these refugees by letter to translate Animal Farm into Ukrainian, and they give it out in the refugee camps. And I learned about this story, and I said, oh, thank God, this is my happy ending. Gareth Jones is killed, but the truth lives on in Orwell's Animal Farm. And Stalin's own victims get their power back through art, and they get their story told out in the world in a very big way. So Orwell is the revenge. And so I incorporate that into my story, into my script. And then I do research on who these refugees, oops, I told you I'm a little, I do research on who these refugees were that discovered George Orwell. And it turns out that one of the books of this Ukrainian translation of Animal Farm was in my family. I was having dinner here at this farmhouse in New York State with my uncle, who was 15 years old in that refugee camp. And I told him about my script and what I was up to, the new happy ending with Orwell and the Refugees. And my uncle goes, oh yeah, I have a copy of the Animal Farm. I picked it up in the refugee camp when I was a kid. So when his family, my mother's family, immigrated to New York City, they could only take what they could carry. And one of the things they took with them was Orwell's Animal Farm. That's how much that book meant to them. And so I'll go back. So here in this grammar school, this is where my uncle, as a kid, heard about George Orwell for the very first time. Animal Farm is assigned reading to students in the US and Canada and in Great Britain, but for the very first time, it was assigned reading to Ukrainians in this refugee camp. So I took all this research, I did not have a movie yet, but I took all this research and I self-published a book, an Amazon Kindle, and I had a bunch of smart friends and my mother read it religiously. I did this all myself, financed it myself, and I put it up on Kindle. I have this friend, Molly Crabapple, the artist, who was a great inspiration for me. I watched her build community. I watched her do things on social media to get her story out, not wait for permission from anyone. And Molly did the cover. There she is getting arrested at the Occupy Wall Street movement. So I wanted her to do the cover because of what she stood for. She's a journalist, she's an artist, she's somebody that's absolutely defiant and takes on creates her own power by building community. And so when I put the book out there on Amazon, a group of college kids in Toronto called me up and said, we want to send you on a 2-week speaking tour Canada. So I did that. I traveled Canada for 2 weeks giving this talk, basically. And when I got back home, Ukrainians started protesting in Kiev, protesting one of the most corrupt regimes, the Yanukovych regime in Ukraine's history. There's an estimated $100 billion that was stolen from the Ukrainian people under Yanukovych. And so I was stuck at home in Brooklyn watching the Western press completely asleep on this issue and getting the story wrong and not knowing what they were talking about. There were some articles in mainstream media sympathizing with the riot police that were beating protesters, that were risking their lives and freedom fighting for democracy. There was also articles that were trying to paint the entire movement as like a neo-Nazi movement and really sort of simplifying the issue, giving it like bad labels that weren't accurate. You had Jewish leaders on the ground in Kiev saying, no, we're here too. This is a popular uprising. This is bringing our country together. And so I did something I never thought I would imagine doing. I'm quite an introvert. I'm a writer. I stay at home with my cats. I'm most comfortable that way. And I was in crisis here in Brooklyn watching on a live stream protesters being beaten in Kiev at 5 a.m. And I had to do something. And I think in the world today, you have the choice to be in despair and stay in bed all day, and you have no reason to get out because you can work as hard as you want, but the other forces will be more determined, more powerful, better funded than you. And so I was feeling very much this way, what's the point? And so I decided that I can stay in bed all day, or I can do something. I can just do one small little thing. I can choose hope over despair, and that is what I did. And it was a very difficult decision at the time, but I put myself out there and I did it. And what that was I created a Facebook event page, and I said, hey everybody, it's Friday. Meet me Monday, 10 a.m. on Twitter at the exact same moment. I'm gonna post a list of pre-made tweets targeting, tweets that are going to be sent to world leaders, to major journalists, telling them to cover the violence against pro-democracy protesters in Ukraine. And I'm going to tell, the tweets are also going to be sent to good journalists that understand the story, that are covering what's happening in Ukraine. And the tweets are going to ask them, please investigate any Russian aggression happening against the protesters in Ukraine. And I sent out my Facebook invite. The college kids that sent me on a 2-week speaking tour of Canada, I asked them to send it out. This thing went viral like a forest fire. My stretch goal was 200 people. Within 2 days, 30,000 people had signed up for this Twitter storm. And we all swarmed Twitter at the exact same moment. And I provided people with tweets in 7 different languages, including Dutch, Italian, French, and so forth. And this is what we did together. So we made Digital Maidan, Euromaidan. Euromaidan was the movement for democracy, against corruption, against a stronger, stable Ukraine, being a part of Europe, essentially. So Euromaidan was a revolution. We were Digital Maidan. And I'd never done anything like this before in my life. I was very terrified to do this, and we did it. We did it. And what was amazing is that here are all the countries around the world that participated. You can't really tell here, but one of the darkest countries that comes up on this map is Ukraine. So what we did was we provided a media strategy for Ukrainians to alert the world of what was happening to them in 7 different languages. And we had press and all kinds of newspapers around the world. There were random people I'd never met, donating art for the movement. We continue to do more Twitter storms. Here's the former Prime Minister of France at the time, sharing our hashtag. And right before all this happened, I wrote a story for Time predicting that in the early days of Ukraine's revolution, that this simply wasn't going to be a revolution. This was going to be war. This was going to be war. And that seemed like a really crazy thing to say in December 2013. But what ends up happening in the spring, in a couple months later, is war. Russia invades first in Crimea and then Donbass, where my grandfather was born. And how many, am I done? I can't, oh no, sorry guys, my coordinator, what is that number? I feel like I've just totally disregarded the number I was supposed to pay attention to, so you can flag me down. Oh, I have 20 seconds. So the reason why I was able to predict that is because I knew history. Here's Agnieszka Holland on set with me, cutting some lines for my script, no doubt. Here is an extra on the set. A lot of our extras were moved to tears because they all had stories of the famine in their family. Here was a scene that my grandfather wrote about in his memoir before he passed away. And no matter how many years I edited the script and how many script notes we got, the scene of what my grandfather witnessed, of a woman lying dead on the side of the road and being pawed at by her still living child, trying to wake up his dead mother. They were thrown like trash into the body collector's wagon and carted off. That scene survived 14 years of rewrites, and it's in the final film. And I sent that out to everyone the night before we shot it. And there's that scene. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.